This is my true story. After 10 long years, I finally decided to visit my son. I imagined warmth, laughter, and a long overdue hug. I carried a small gift, a framed photo of the day we built our first house together. But when I arrived at his address, something inside me went still. The house looked familiar, painfully familiar. Every wall, every design, every window whispered my past. I didn't realize it at first, but standing there, I understood. My son hadn't just built a house. He had rebuilt my life and taken my name off it. Before I tell you what happened, please like this video and subscribe so my story can reach more hearts. He had spent 10 long years away from home, 10 years of silence, of waiting for a call that never came. Time had changed his hands. They trembled now when he held things. His back curved slightly, but his heart still carried the weight of fatherhood, the hope that maybe, after all the distance, there could be warmth again. That morning, he packed carefully, like it was the first day of a new life. A clean shirt, a small leather wallet, a silver watch that once belonged to his own father, and one gift, a framed photograph of the day he and his son stood proudly outside their first home. He didn't have much left to offer. No fortune, no grand words, but he had love. That was enough, he thought. He boarded the train early, sitting by the window, watching the landscape roll by like memory itself. Every station brought back a piece of the past, the laughter of a young boy running beside him, the noise of tools clinking when they built together, the long evenings spent talking about dreams neither of them could yet afford. Those were the years when everything felt certain. As the journey went on, he rehearsed what he would say. He wanted to tell his son how proud he still was, how he'd always believed in him, even when their paths had separated, how not a day went by that he didn't think about calling but didn't, afraid of being unwanted. 10 years is a long time to be silent, and he hoped the years hadn't hardened his boy. By afternoon, he reached the city, a place that now seemed foreign. Towering buildings rose where old streets used to breathe. He hailed a cab and handed the driver the address his son had written years ago on a birthday card. He remembered the handwriting, sharp, clean, and full of confidence. He looked out the window as the car moved through wide roads lined with mansions, tall iron gates, and gardens that looked like they were built for show, not peace. He smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "He's done well." The sight filled him with pride, but also a small ache, the kind that comes when a parent realizes how much time has been lost. He didn't know whether his son had a wife, children, or what kind of man he had become. He only knew that he had survived, and for that, the father was grateful. As the car slowed down, the driver pointed to a house number that matched the address. The man looked up, his smile fading slowly. The house that stood before him wasn't just familiar, it was identical. Every window frame, every curve of the archway, every detail of the porch. It wasn't a coincidence. He knew that design. He had drawn it. He had built it with his own hands decades ago when he still had his business, his dreams, and his pride. He stepped out of the car slowly, heart pounding with confusion. The house had the same stone path, the same white fence, even the same old oak tree in the yard. Only this one was grander, a replica perfected, expanded, and polished, but unmistakably his. It was as if someone had taken his memories, repainted them, and called them their own. He stood at the gate for a moment, the framed photograph pressed against his chest. He didn't know what to feel, pride, shock, or betrayal. A strange mixture of all three clouded his heart. For a long moment, he couldn't move. The driver asked gently, "Sir, are you okay?" He nodded faintly, paid the fare, and stepped closer to the gate, staring through it at the world that used to be his. He remembered the day his old house was taken from him, after the bankruptcy, after the debts piled high. His son had promised to take care of things, to keep the family safe. He remembered signing the papers, handing over the last of his savings, saying, "You'll rebuild it one day, son. You'll carry our name forward." Now standing before the house, he realized those words had come true, but not in the way he had imagined. His son hadn't rebuilt the dream. He had stolen it. He straightened his back as much as he could, took a deep breath, and pressed the doorbell. Whatever waited behind that door, warmth, rejection, or truth, he was ready to face it. Because after 10 years, he wasn't just visiting his son. He was walking into the shadow of his own past. The drive toward his son's home felt longer than it was. The road stretched endlessly, lined with polished houses that all looked the same. Perfect lawns, trimmed hedges, glass windows that hid more than they revealed. Yet as he drew closer to the final turn, something strange began to stir in his chest. The closer he came, the more everything looked familiar. Not just familiar, identical. When the driver slowed down and pointed to the address, he stared at the number on the gate, frozen. The house that stood before him was not simply his son's. It was his. The very same blueprint, the same dimensions, the same porch steps that he had once measured by hand. He remembered laying those foundations with pride when he was younger, pouring everything he owned and everything he was into that home. His late wife had chosen the window curtains. His son had helped paint the wooden fence white. It was supposed to be their legacy, but after the bankruptcy, after the endless nights of debt and shame, it was gone, lost to the bank. Or so he thought. Now it stood there again, only this time, under his son's name. The same design, the same oak tree in the yard. Even the front door had the same old brass handle, the one he'd bought from a flea market for good luck. He could still remember the faint dent near the edge, the one that appeared when he accidentally dropped a toolbox. That dent was there, exactly where it had always been. His heart thumped so hard he could hear it. He took a shaky breath and stepped out of the car. His shoes crunched against the gravel path, the same sound it made when he used to come home after work. He ran his fingers along the white fence, feeling the smoothness of fresh paint over old wood. It was as if time itself had folded, replaying his past, but in someone else's name. As he approached the porch, he noticed something small but piercing: the doormat. It had the family's last name embroidered on it, his name, except it wasn't followed by SR anymore. It was followed by Junior. His son had taken even that. He stood there for a long moment, clutching the framed photo against his chest. The image inside was fading now, a younger version of him and his son smiling in front of the first home they ever built together. Back then, the boy had been full of admiration, eager to learn, proud to follow in his father's footsteps. But now, that same boy had stepped into his father's shoes and never looked back. The sound of laughter drifted from inside the house. A woman's voice, soft but unfamiliar, then a child's giggle. He swallowed hard. The family he'd hoped to reconnect with. It wasn't his anymore. It was his son's world now, built on the ruins of his own. He adjusted his coat, straightened his back, and rang the doorbell. The chime echoed like a ghost from memory. For a brief moment, he wished it would all be a misunderstanding. Maybe his son had rebuilt the house as a tribute. Maybe it was a sign of respect. He wanted to believe that. The door opened. His son stood there, older, sharper, dressed in an expensive suit. His expression flickered between shock and discomfort. Behind him, the house glowed warm and rich, filled with life. But there was no recognition in his eyes, no warmth, no welcome. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other. The silence between them was heavier than all the years they had spent apart. Then, forcing a polite smile, the son spoke briefly to someone inside and turned back to him with a restrained gesture, as if inviting an unwanted guest. The father stepped in slowly. The air smelled faintly of the same wood polish his wife used to love. His gaze wandered across the room. The furniture, the curtains, the family photos lining the wall. Everything looked like a reflection of his past, except the faces in the frames were strangers. He lowered himself onto the edge of a leather sofa and ran his fingers across a table carved with the same pattern he had once designed for his workshop. It wasn't coincidence. It was theft, not of objects, but of memory. of identity, of life itself. And as he sat there, surrounded by his own history painted under a different name, a thought quietly rose within him. Not anger, but sorrow. His son hadn't just built this house. He had stolen the man who once dreamed of it. The moment he stepped into that house, it was as though time had folded in half. Every corner whispered fragments of his past. The color of the walls, the shape of the staircase, even the way the afternoon light filtered through the curtains. He could almost hear the echoes of hammers striking wood, of laughter between father and son while they worked side by side. But those sounds weren't memories now. They were ghosts haunting him in the very home his own blood had stolen. Years ago, everything had fallen apart. His business, the construction firm he'd built from the ground up, had collapsed after a partnership gone wrong. Debts piled up, and creditors stripped him of everything but his dignity. His health had started to fail around the same time, leaving him tired, broken, and uncertain. Through all of it, he had one comfort: his son, the boy he'd raised to be honest, hardworking, and loyal. The boy who had promised to carry their name forward when he no longer could. He remembered the day he'd handed his son the last of his savings. Money meant for retirement, for safety, for a future he no longer expected to see. "Take it," he had said back then. "Start fresh. Build something you can be proud of. Don't let my failure become yours." He thought he was helping him. He thought that was what fathers were meant to do. But after that day, the son disappeared. Calls went unanswered. Letters returned unopened. Rumors trickled in from mutual friends that the boy had moved away, started something new, maybe even changed his name. The father told himself it was temporary, that maybe the shame of seeing his father broken kept the boy from coming home. That's what he believed for years. That's how he survived, by holding on to the hope that one day his son would come back, not just successful, but still good. Now, standing in this house, he saw the truth. His son hadn't started over. He had taken over. The blueprints he once sketched, the designs that came from his mind and heart, now existed here under another man's name. Every detail screamed of theft disguised as success. He wandered deeper into the living room, eyes tracing the edges of familiar patterns, the crown molding on the ceiling, the way the tiles met perfectly at the corners, even the small crack running beneath the windowsill. He'd made that mistake himself once and had promised to fix it the next morning. Seeing it replicated exactly here, even down to the imperfection, sent a chill through his chest. A younger man might have screamed, might have demanded answers, but he didn't. He stood quietly, his silence heavy enough to crush everything around him. He understood something that only time can teach. Betrayal doesn't always come with a knife. Sometimes it comes wearing your own reflection. As he looked around, his heart sank deeper with every familiar thing. The paintings on the walls, copies of the ones his wife had chosen years ago. The fireplace mantel, carved with the same initials he once etched for his family, now sanded over and replaced with another nameplate. Even the clock on the shelf ticked in the same rhythm as the one that had once hung in his old study. It was like watching his entire life replayed by an imposter. He reached out and touched one of the framed photos on the wall, a family portrait of his son, daughter-in-law, and 2 children. They were smiling in front of the house, the same way he and his wife had once posed for their first photograph decades ago. It was identical, only now he was missing from it. The man who gave life to this family had been edited out like he never existed. As his eyes filled with tears, a thought came that chilled him more than anger ever could. His son hadn't just stolen his design or his home. He had stolen his legacy. He turned toward the door slowly, taking one last look at the house that was once his dream. For a moment, he saw flashes of the past, his younger self laughing with his wife on that same porch, his son helping him paint the fence white, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen in the early mornings. It was all gone now, replaced by wealth, arrogance, and lies. As he stepped outside, he took one last look at the front yard. The oak tree he had planted as a sapling now stood tall and proud, just as he'd hoped it would. Only now, its shade didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to someone who had forgotten where its roots came from. The door opened wider, and for the first time in 10 years, father and son stood face to face. The silence that hung between them was thick, heavier than words could fill. The son's eyes flickered for a moment, as though recognizing something he didn't want to admit. The father saw the faint resemblance of the boy he once held, the same tilt of the head, the same quick frown before speaking. But the warmth was gone. What remained was polish, pride, and distance. The son stepped aside, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Come in," he said quietly, but his tone carried the weight of formality, not affection. The old man nodded, stepping inside carefully. The floor beneath his shoes gleamed. The scent of expensive polish lingered in the air. Every detail of the house seemed to echo a past he had built, yet it now belonged to someone who had erased his name from it. Inside, voices floated from the kitchen. Laughter, clinking glasses, the easy rhythm of family life that no longer included him. The old man's heart trembled at the sound. He had dreamed of this, of coming back to a table where love still lived. But this wasn't that home anymore. This was a stage, and he was an uninvited guest. His son led him to the living room. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing toward a couch that looked strikingly familiar. The same design his wife had chosen long ago, with the exact embroidery pattern she adored. The father lowered himself slowly, his hand brushing against the fabric. Even the smallest details screamed of memory. He tried not to show emotion, but the ache spread quietly through his chest. He looked around the room, letting his eyes travel across the framed photographs on the walls. Every single one captured a version of his son's new life. Elegant dinners, family vacations, smiling portraits. But there wasn't a single trace of him. The man who had built the foundation of that life was missing entirely, as though he had never existed. A woman appeared from the kitchen, the daughter-in-law he'd never met. She greeted him politely, but cautiously, as if unsure who he truly was. When his son introduced him as a distant relative from the old town, she smiled kindly, unaware of the lie that hung in the air. The father returned the smile, though it cracked faintly at the corners. He understood now that even his presence had been rewritten. Dinner was served at a long, polished table that resembled the one he had once carved himself. The silverware gleamed under soft light. The plates looked like the set his wife had collected piece by piece over the years. He ate quietly, answering polite questions about his travels and old days. His son barely looked at him, busy keeping the conversation controlled, polished, safe. At one point, the youngest grandchild climbed onto his lap without hesitation, laughing freely. The father's eyes softened. The innocence of that small gesture pierced through everything else. The child didn't know about the silence, the betrayal, or the years of absence. To him, the old man was simply someone kind, someone familiar. That tiny warmth almost broke the father's heart again. After dinner, his son offered to show him around the house. The tour felt like walking through stolen memories. The office bore the same dark oak shelves he had once owned. The study's arrangement mirrored his old one, down to the placement of the globe on the corner desk. The son spoke proudly of his designs and inspirations, unaware that every word struck his father like a quiet wound. Then came the final blow. A hallway, lined with family photos. One in particular caught his attention. His son standing proudly beside a plaque that read, "For my father, who inspired me." Underneath, the inscription bore his son's name, not his. The message that should have been gratitude now felt like mockery. Inspiration had turned into erasure. He stood there in silence, pretending to admire the photo while his son waited for praise. But inside, his chest burned. This wasn't inspiration. This was theft, dressed as honor. And yet, he said nothing. He thanked them both for dinner, smiled politely, and asked if his son could drop him back to the station. His voice didn't tremble, though his heart did. When they reached the door, he turned back one last time. The house glowed behind him, bright and beautiful, everything he had once dreamed for his family. But as the door closed, he realized it wasn't his dream anymore. It was his shadow, worn proudly by the very man who had stolen his light. The house was stunning in every way, but each step through it felt like walking through the remains of his own life, polished, painted, and claimed by another. What his son called home was, in truth, the blueprint of a man he had once been. He moved slowly through the hallways, his old heart heavy but calm, his eyes scanning the walls for details his memory still held with painful precision. Then, in the living room, his gaze froze. Above the fireplace hung the family crest, the same one that had belonged to his father and grandfather. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. The same carved initials, the same gold outline, even the same chip on the lower right edge that had happened during a move decades ago. He stepped closer, his breath shallow. That crest had been lost when the bank repossessed his estate all those years ago. Somehow, his son had recovered it, and instead of restoring its meaning, he had polished away the past and hung it under his own name. Beside it hung a certificate framed in gold, titled Founding Director, Daniel Jr. Construction Group. The word struck him harder than any insult could. His son hadn't just built a business. He had resurrected his father's company, the very one that once bore his name, but rewritten the story so completely that the world believed the younger man had created it from scratch. The father's legacy, his sweat, his struggles, his failures and triumphs, all erased and replaced with a cleaner, shinier lie. He felt his hands trembling as he traced the edge of the frame. The certificate's date matched the same year his son had disappeared. All this time, while the father had lived in quiet shame, the son had built his success on the bones of the man who raised him. He turned toward the study next. The heavy oak door creaked slightly. The sound alone was enough to pull him backward in time. He remembered crafting that same soundproof design in his original house, making the door thick enough so his wife wouldn't hear him working late. Now it stood here again, polished, perfect, without memory, except his. Inside, the shock deepened. The walls were lined with books he once owned, rare architectural editions he'd collected over 40 years. The spines were familiar, the small markings at the bottom still in his handwriting. They hadn't been replaced or replicated. They were the very books he'd lost. Somehow, his son had bought them back from the auction house that had liquidated his estate, but instead of returning them, he'd built a shrine to himself out of what once represented his father's passion. He sank into the leather chair by the desk, another relic from his past, though newly reupholstered. As he placed his hand on the desk's edge, his fingers brushed against a small scratch, the same one he'd made years ago when his wedding ring scraped against it during late nights of paperwork. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. Nothing in this room was coincidence. It was deliberate, a reconstruction of his father's identity repainted in the colors of pride and deceit. For a long while, he sat there in silence, surrounded by familiar things that no longer belonged to him. The fireplace crackled softly, the clock on the wall ticked in rhythm with his heartbeat, and somewhere outside, his grandchildren laughed in the garden. That sound alone stopped him from collapsing completely. The innocence of their voices reminded him that not everything in this home was corrupted. He rose slowly, his cane tapping softly against the polished floor, and walked toward a cabinet near the window. Inside, framed in silver, was a family portrait, his son, his daughter-in-law, and their 2 children. At the corner of the photo, engraved neatly, were the words, "The House That Built Us." He stared at the line for a long time, letting the bitter irony sink in. The house hadn't built them. He had. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye on the far shelf, a trophy with an inscription that read, "In honor of vision and legacy, presented to Daniel Jr." His throat tightened. Legacy. The word twisted inside him like a knife. His legacy had been stolen, reshaped, and handed to a man who couldn't even look him in the eye with honesty. And yet, through the pain, he felt a strange calm settling in his chest. He understood now that revenge didn't have to be loud. Truth would find its way out. It always did. He would not destroy his son with rage. He would let justice restore the balance that time had tried to erase. He stepped out into the garden, the evening air heavy with silence. The sunset stretched across the sky in shades of gold and red, the same way it had on the evenings when he and his wife used to sit together after long work days. The air smelled of trimmed grass and jasmine, a scent that once belonged to home, now belonging to memory. His cane pressed into the soft soil as he walked slowly toward the back of the house. He needed air, space, and distance from the walls that screamed his name, but bore his son's signature. He followed the sound of rustling leaves until he reached the oak tree standing tall at the edge of the yard. Its roots were deep, its branches wide, the very tree he had planted decades ago in another life, in another home. Seeing it here stopped him cold. The bench beneath it looked exactly the same as the one he had built by hand for his wife's birthday. The curves, the carvings, even the faint scratch along the armrest, it was all identical. He lowered himself onto the bench, running his hand along the wood grain. Beneath the armrest, his fingers brushed against a small plaque, gleaming in the fading light. He leaned closer and read the inscription, "For my father, who inspired me." For a moment, his heart caught in his throat. It was supposed to be touching, a tribute perhaps, a sign of respect. But there was no sincerity in it. It was a monument built on stolen ground. He realized, sitting there, that his son had taken everything, not out of need, but out of pride. It wasn't enough to inherit success. He had to erase its source. He had built a kingdom of comfort on a foundation of deceit. The bench was no longer a gift of love. It was a stage prop in a story rewritten to make one man look greater by pretending another never existed. The night grew colder. He looked up at the house, the lights glowing through the windows, laughter spilling faintly into the dark. He saw silhouettes moving, his grandchildren, his son, his daughter-in-law, living happily inside the shell of a life he once owned. A strange peace mixed with heartbreak inside him. He didn't hate them. Hate was too small for what he felt. What filled him now was something heavier, something like mourning. Mourning not for the past, but for the truth that had been buried beneath years of silence and lies. He thought of the years he'd spent waiting for a letter, a call, any sign of his son. The endless birthdays where he'd bought gifts and kept them unopened. The holidays where he'd left a plate empty at the table, hoping his boy might walk through the door. He had given him everything, not just money or comfort, but wisdom, trust, and love. And in return, the boy had buried him alive under the weight of success. But sitting there, the old man realized something profound. Even though his son had stolen his legacy, he hadn't stolen his truth. The truth still lived inside the quiet details. The curve of the roof, the design of the window panes, the way the garden bloomed in perfect symmetry. Those were his. And no amount of deceit could rewrite where they came from. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the sky. He thought of what his wife would have said if she were alive to see this. She would have told him not to seek vengeance, that pride and peace couldn't live in the same heart. And she would have been right. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice, quiet and unshakable. As the wind rustled through the leaves, he made a silent promise. He would reclaim what was his, not through confrontation or shouting, but through proof, through patience, through truth. His son had built his empire on a lie, but that lie had cracks, and soon those cracks would show. When he finally stood to leave, the world felt heavier, but his steps were steadier. The betrayal no longer crushed him, it fueled him. He turned back once more toward the bench, toward the plaque that bore false praise, and whispered to himself, not in bitterness, but in calm certainty, I inspired him. Yes, just not in the way he thinks. That night, back in the small hotel room on the edge of town, he sat by the window, the moonlight spilling over the briefcase at his feet. The day's discoveries still burned behind his eyes, the walls lined with his books, the crest above the fireplace, the certificate that erased his name. But the ache had settled into something sharper, something deliberate. Betrayal had taken what was his, but now it had given him purpose again. He placed the briefcase on the table and unlocked it. Inside were papers yellowed by time, blueprints, property deeds, financial documents, and design sketches. Each one bore his original signature in fading ink. They were the last surviving evidence of his life's work, stored carefully all these years like relics of a man forgotten. He'd carried them with him everywhere, even when he had no home to return to. Tonight, they would finally serve their purpose. He began to sort them carefully, laying them across the table in neat rows. The original design of the house, the same one his son now claimed to have built, rested in front of him, complete with annotations, handwritten notes, and structural details only he could have known. He smiled faintly at the irony. His son might have stolen the story, but he'd forgotten that the truth was written in ink long before lies were spoken aloud. He reached for the small leather folder that held his old property titles. One by one, he flipped through them, verifying that his name, Daniel Sr., still appeared on several dormant registrations tied to his previous estate and intellectual designs. The bank had liquidated the assets years ago, but the creative rights, the trademarks, and the patents had never been legally transferred. That small oversight, invisible to most, was his key. He spent hours reviewing every document, cross-referencing dates, signatures, and legal seals. What his son had built looked solid from the outside, but beneath the surface, it was fragile, a structure resting on stolen ground. The designs that powered the company's foundation, its core blueprints and creative patents, all traced back to him. He didn't need to destroy his son publicly. The law would do that quietly for him. As dawn began to bleed through the curtains, he closed the final folder and leaned back, exhausted but calm. Revenge wasn't the word for what he felt. It was something cleaner, quieter, and more certain. He didn't wish his son harm. He simply wanted truth to reclaim its name. After a long sip of coffee, he picked up the phone and dialed an old number, one he hadn't used in decades. A familiar voice answered, older now, but still warm. It belonged to a lawyer, an old friend who had once helped him during the collapse of his business. They spoke briefly, the lawyer listening in silence as the old man explained everything. The documents, the lies, the stolen identity. There was no anger in his voice, only clarity. By the end of the call, arrangements were in motion. The lawyer would reopen his old design files and begin verifying ownership records. Quietly, discreetly, they would begin transferring every design patent and property license back to the rightful name. There would be no warning, no confrontation, no shouting across dinner tables, only letters, filings, and signatures that would rewrite the truth legally and permanently. That night, as he packed the documents back into the briefcase, he glanced once more at the photograph he had brought for his son, the last photo they had taken together, both of them smiling, unaware of what the years ahead would hold. He folded it gently and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. He didn't hate his son. Hate was loud, and he no longer had the strength for noise. He would fight this the way only the old and the wise could, through silence and precision. Before lying down, he looked out the window toward the town's skyline. Somewhere beyond those lights stood the house that wasn't his anymore, the life that had been rewritten. But as the night deepened, he smiled faintly. His son might own the walls for now, but soon the truth would own the foundation. Weeks passed quietly, as if the world itself had forgotten him, but beneath that calm, things were shifting, quietly, powerfully, and irrevocably. What began as a few calls to an old lawyer soon turned into a storm of paperwork, filings, and inquiries that reached deep into his son's empire. He didn't have to lift a finger after that first step. Truth had taken its course, and once truth starts moving, nothing can stop it. The first signs came as whispers in the financial press, a brief note about an investigation into inconsistent documentation behind several property claims linked to Daniel Jr. Construction Group. A few days later, there was talk of a government audit and legal verification of historical blueprints tied to the company's earliest projects. His son had built his success on the assumption that the past had no witnesses. But the past was alive, and it had come knocking in the form of official letters and sealed envelopes. He sat in his small countryside home as news trickled in from his lawyer. Each report brought another quiet victory. One by one, the legal documents began confirming what had been hidden, that every design, patent, and foundational concept used in his son's company originated from him, not the boy who claimed them. It wasn't theft that the court saw first, it was fraud. Fraud dressed in luxury suits and expensive smiles. He never told anyone what was happening, not his friends, not his neighbors, not even his lawyer's assistant who asked if he wanted the press involved. He wanted no cameras, no interviews, no headlines. The exposure he sought wasn't the loud kind. He wanted the kind that made silence feel like justice, the kind that stripped away lies until truth stood naked and undeniable. As the investigation deepened, his son's world began to shake. Investors withdrew, fearing association with controversy. Clients hesitated to sign new contracts. The company's website went offline for maintenance, though everyone knew it was for survival. For years, his son had lived as a man untouchable, praised, envied, respected. But now, he was learning what it felt like to have the ground beneath him questioned, the very foundation that he had stolen. One morning, the old man received a parcel from his lawyer. Inside was a copy of the court's official notice. It was simple, almost cold in tone, but every word felt like warmth to him. Ownership of the designs and intellectual property of the following projects are hereby returned to their original author, Daniel Wilson, Sr. He read that line over and over, his hands trembling slightly. The law had spoken. Quietly, firmly, and permanently. That same evening, he turned on the television, and the local news channel was reporting a story about a successful businessman under investigation for legacy misappropriation. The footage showed his son stepping out of a car, flanked by reporters asking questions he couldn't answer. The camera zoomed in on his face, pale, lost, and furious. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the screen. The son looked straight into the camera, unaware his father was on the other side, watching. The old man didn't feel triumph. What he felt was closure, the kind that doesn't shout or celebrate. He had spent a lifetime teaching his son about integrity, about how success without honesty is just theft in disguise. Now fate had delivered that lesson in the only way it could. He didn't gloat or smile. He simply turned off the television, exhaled, and sat in silence, letting the weight of it all settle like dust after a long storm. A few days later, he received another message. This time, a simple envelope with no return address. Inside was a single folded note written in a familiar hand. "I never meant to erase you, Dad. I just wanted to become you." He read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it beside his old photograph, the one of father and son smiling before pride had built walls between them. He didn't respond. Some things didn't need answers anymore. Truth had spoken for him. When the dust finally settled, peace didn't arrive like applause. It came like morning fog, soft and slow. The noise around his son's scandal faded, replaced by silence that felt heavier but truer. The world had seen the truth, and that was enough. There was no triumph to celebrate, no satisfaction in another man's downfall, only a quiet sense of balance restored. He sold the remaining shares of his designs to a small architecture firm that valued integrity over fame. The money wasn't important anymore. What mattered was knowing the work would continue honestly. He moved back into his small countryside cottage, the same one he'd built with his own 2 hands, before ambition had ever clouded love. The house was modest, with creaking floors and a garden that bloomed unevenly, but it was his. Every nail, every brick, Every imperfection carried his truth. Each morning, he brewed tea and watched sunlight spill across the worn wooden table. The briefcase, now empty, sat on a shelf above the fireplace, a relic of battles fought with ink instead of anger. Sometimes he'd glance at it and smile faintly. Inside that case, once filled with papers and proof, had lived the weight of betrayal. Now it held only peace. He started writing again, not legal documents this time, but letters. Letters to his younger self, to the man who had believed too easily, to the father who had given everything. He wrote about mistakes, forgiveness, and the thin line between pride and love. Each word felt lighter than the last, as though he were clearing the dust of decades from his heart. The locals in the nearby village soon came to know him as the quiet old builder. They didn't know the story behind his calm eyes, only that he was kind, patient, and wise. When children passed his gate after school, he'd wave and sometimes hand them small carved toys he made in his shed. His hands, though aged, still remembered creation, not destruction. On Sundays, he'd walk to the small hill behind his cottage where wild flowers grew. From there, he could see the horizon stretch endlessly. No skyscrapers, no noise, no ghosts of the past. He'd sit on a bench, close his eyes, and breathe deeply, feeling the earth beneath him, the same earth that had once held everything he'd lost. In that quiet life, he found something far greater than revenge. He found understanding. His son had stolen his designs, his legacy, his name, but in doing so, he had also freed him from the burden of recognition. The old man no longer needed the world to remember who he was. The soil remembered. The wood remembered. The wind that passed through the cracks of his home whispered his story better than any newspaper ever could. Sometimes he'd receive letters, people who had read about him, thanking him for showing that justice could be quiet, that truth didn't always shout. He never replied, but he read every word. Each letter felt like a small return on the long investment of his patience. One evening, as the sun melted into the hills, he placed the old photograph, the one he had taken to give his son, on the windowsill. The faces were younger, untouched by years or disappointment. He didn't look at it with sorrow anymore, only gratitude. Gratitude for the life that had broken and rebuilt him, for the lessons that came wrapped in pain. He had lost his fortune, his family, his legacy, but he had gained peace, a kind of peace that didn't depend on others, only on truth. And that truth, finally, belonged only to him. Now, as an old man, his reflection carries no bitterness, only understanding. He sits by the same window every evening, watching the sun lower itself behind the trees, casting golden shadows across his table. The world outside feels quieter than it used to, and so does he. The noise of ambition, betrayal, and pride has faded, leaving behind something simpler, purer, peace earned through survival. He often thinks about his son, not with anger, but with a strange kind of mercy. He knows now that greed grows from fear, not evil. His son had feared failure, feared being ordinary, feared living in his father's shadow. In that fear, he built a kingdom out of lies, not realizing that a house built on stolen ground eventually caves in. The old man doesn't hate him for it anymore. He simply pities him, because while his son owned everything, he had peace with nothing. Sometimes he wonders if his son ever understood what he lost. The money, the titles, the recognition, none of it mattered in the end. Legacy isn't written on buildings. It's carried in memory, and memory can't be stolen, forged, or buried. The father's designs, his craft, his soul, those still lived quietly in every honest wall he'd built long before his son's deceit. That was enough. He walks slowly now, with a cane carved from oak, and sometimes passes the local children building small forts with sticks and mud in the field nearby. He smiles at them, watching their innocent teamwork, their laughter untainted by greed. They remind him of what creation is meant to feel like, joy without ownership. He always pauses for a moment, breathes in the air, and whispers to himself, "That's how it all began." On his bookshelf rests one small frame, the blueprint of his first design, signed in faded ink. Beneath it, a note written in his own shaky hand. Truth doesn't age. Every time he looks at it, he remembers that justice, too, doesn't rush. It waits, quietly, patiently, until the world is ready to see. At night, when the world falls still, he writes in a leather journal. Small thoughts, not for the world, just for himself. My son stole my life, one page reads, but I took back my truth. On another, he built an empire with my hands, but I built peace with my heart. These aren't regrets. They're reminders that a man's worth isn't in what he loses, but in how he rebuilds. He has forgiven the past, not because it deserved it, but because his heart did. Bitterness, he learned, is another kind of theft. It steals your final years and calls it justice. He didn't want that. He wanted calm mornings, honest work, and quiet dignity. And now, that's all he lives with. Sometimes the wind rustles through the trees outside, and he imagines it's whispering the same words his younger self once said to his boy. Build with care. Perhaps somewhere his son hears it too. Maybe not with his ears, but with his conscience. Maybe one day he'll understand that the truest inheritance a father gives isn't money or property. It's the lesson of how to live without losing your soul. The old man finishes his tea, sets the cup down, and smiles faintly. His story isn't one of revenge, it's one of restoration. He didn't fight fire with fire, he rebuilt quietly and let truth burn on its own. Final thought. He stole my life and wore it like a crown, but I kept my truth, and that was the only kingdom that lasted.